The form was in the wrong folder. That was all it was at first. A single chain of custody documents sitting in the wrong manila folder inside a banker's box that had no business being on Marlene Doss's cart in the first place. The box belonged to the property room at the Harwick Police Department, had been requested as part of a routine digital conversion project, and Marlene had been moving through 32 of them over the past 3 weeks with the methodical patience of someone who understood that nobody was watching and nothing exciting was going to happen. She was pulling Form HPDCC22 from a folder labeled State v. Terrell Odom, 14 CR 0887 when her thumb caught the edge of something thicker behind it. 2 documents fused at the corner by what looked like old coffee. She peeled them apart carefully, the way you do with wet newspaper, and saw that the second one was labeled State v. Marcus Webb, 14 CR 1042. Marlene set both on her desk and looked at them side by side under the fluorescent light that buzzed faintly above her workstation in the basement of the Caldwell County DA's office. Outside the narrow window well near the ceiling, she could hear the occasional shoe on the sidewalk, the muffled bass of someone's car stereo idling at the light on Prescott Street. She cross-referenced the Odom file first. Everything checked out, a evidence log-matched chain of custody was unbroken, photos of the seized narcotics were stapled to the back. Routine, she initialed it and set it in the digitized pile. Then she picked up the web form. The case number was familiar to her the way all case numbers eventually become familiar when you've worked in the same building for 11 years. Not because she remembered the particulars of Marcus Webb, but because the number itself had a shape, a rhythm she'd processed before. She pulled up the digital index on her screen, typed in 14 CR 1042 and waited. The record came up. Marcus Webb, 34, possession with intent to distribute, Schedule II, pled guilty November 2014, sentenced to 7 years, Caldwell Correctional. She scrolled down to the evidence manifest. The drugs that were listed as the basis for the conviction, 312 grams of methamphetamine in 2 sealed bags, did not appear on the chain of custody form in her hand. She read it again. The form in her hand documented a different seizure entirely, 40 grams of marijuana and a digital scale. Different case, different substance, different quantity. The case number had been written in by hand at the top of the form, and whoever had written it had written 1042 when the correct number should have been something else. Marlene sat with that for a moment. The building hummed around her. Somewhere upstairs a phone rang twice and stopped. She was not an attorney, she was not a detective. She was a records and evidence coordinator, GS7, with a benefits package and a parking pass, and a son named Eli who was 12 years old and currently obsessed with a video game she didn't understand. She had a Honda Civic with 94,000 miles on it parked in the side lot. She had a dentist appointment Thursday. She set the form in a third pile, neither digitized nor returned, and kept working. Harwick, North Carolina sits in the Piedmont region about 60 miles northeast of Charlotte, and it has the weather of a city that can't decide what it wants to be. In August the air is thick enough to feel like something you're pushing through rather than breathing, and it carries with it the faint ghost of the textile mills that closed in the 90s, machine oil, and something chemical and sweet that no one who grew up there can quite name but everyone recognizes. The city has 84,000 people and a downtown that's been in the process of revitalization for as long as anyone can remember, meaning there are wine bars next to boarded storefronts and a farmer's market that operates on Saturdays and a homeless population that has nowhere new to go because the shelters are always full. The police department occupies a building on Garfield Avenue that was originally a bank, and it shows the lobby still has marble floors and the original teller windows, which the department uses for civilian intake. The property room is in the basement, behind 2 keypad doors, and it smells of old cardboard and the specific tang of evidence bags that have been sitting for years. Lieutenant Dennis Culver had worked out of the second-floor detective division for the last 8 years, and before that he'd been in patrol for 9, and before that he'd been young enough that it didn't feel like anything he needed to count. He was 46 years old and looked it honestly, not badly, but in the way of a man who has spent considerable time in cars and fluorescent rooms and not enough time sleeping. He kept his hair short on the sides and longer on top, which his wife said looked professional and which his daughter said looked like he was trying. He coached his son Tyler's little league team on Thursday evenings in the spring, and he was genuinely good at it, patient with the kids who couldn't hit and firm with the ones who showboated. He remembered all their names. He made the trophy ceremony personal. He had also, over the course of roughly 10 years, participated in the fabrication or material misrepresentation of evidence in not fewer than 47 criminal cases. He didn't think about it in those terms. He had the capacity to not think about it in those terms, which is a skill that develops slowly and requires practice and a certain willingness to flatten complexity into something more comfortable. The way he thought about it, when he thought about it at all, was that he had made calls. He had looked at situations where the law's machinery was going to produce the wrong outcome and he had intervened. The man was guilty. Everyone knew the man was guilty. The evidence just needed to be arranged so that what everyone knew could be proven. That was different from inventing something. That was filling a gap. The first time had been 2013, a robbery case involving a repeat offender named Deshaun Pratt who had pistol-whipped a convenience store clerk badly enough to cause permanent hearing loss in one ear. The store camera had malfunctioned. The witness recanted. The DA's office was going to cut Pratt loose, and Culver had looked at his partner, Carl Pruitt, and Carl had looked back at him, and neither of them had said anything that could be quoted later. What happened in the property room that afternoon was a matter of record, only in the sense that the record was wrong. Deshaun Pratt went to prison. The store clerk got some measure of quiet. Culver moved forward from there the way most people move forward from the first wrong thing, by not stopping. Ray Fontaine was 33 years old and had been an assistant district attorney in Caldwell County for 4 years, long enough to know who to trust and short enough that he was still occasionally surprised by who that wasn't. He was from Raleigh originally, had done his law degree at Wake Forest, and had come to Harwick because the DA at the time had given a speech at a career fair that had made the work sound serious and important. It still was, in his estimation. He just had a better sense now of the weather. He was eating a sandwich at his desk on a Wednesday in August when Marlene knocked on his open-door frame with a folder tucked under one arm and the expression of someone who has been thinking about something for several days and has finally decided they can't keep thinking about it alone. "You have a minute," she said. Ray knew Marlene the way you know people in the same building, not intimately, but with the specific warmth of accumulated minor interactions. She'd helped him find a misfiled plea agreement once when he was desperate. She brought her own lunch every day in a green bag and she ate it at her desk, and she never complained about anything in the way that some people use not complaining as a form of complaining. He trusted her instincts for the same reason he trusted plumbers. She understood the system at the infrastructure level in a way lawyers rarely bothered to learn. He said yes, and she came in and sat down and put the folder on the edge of his desk. "I want to walk you through something," she said. "And I want you to tell me if I'm reading it wrong because I'd really prefer to be reading it wrong." She walked him through it. The misfiled form, the discrepancy between the web evidence manifest and the chain of custody document, the conviction record that referenced narcotics that didn't appear to have a proper documentation trail. Ray listened. He ate approximately 2 more bites of his sandwich and then stopped eating. He asked her to show him the form again and he read it slowly. The way you read something you're hopping will change on the second read. "This could be a transcription error," he said. "Someone typed the wrong case number into the system when they logged the form." "I know," Marlene said. "That's what I thought. But..." She opened the folder and laid 3 more documents on his desk. "I went back through the box. These are 3 other chain of custody forms from cases in 2014 and 2015, all 3 reference evidence that doesn't match the conviction records for those cases." Ray looked at the documents. The air conditioning in the office had been struggling all week and the room was warm enough that he could feel it behind his eyes, a low, dull pressure. He picked up each form in turn and set it down. "Who else have you shown these to?" he said. "Nobody." "Okay." He picked up his sandwich and then put it down again. "Leave these with me. Don't talk to anyone about this yet, not upstairs, not in the building. You understand what I'm saying?" "I've been doing this job for 11 years, Marlene said. "I know, I'm saying it anyway." She nodded and left. Ray sat for a long time looking at the documents on his desk. Through his window he could see the parking garage across the street and the pale August sky above it and the heat shimmer coming off the concrete levels where cars sat baking in rows. He thought about 4 cases. He thought about what 4 cases meant if the pattern was real and the pattern wasn't limited to 4. He didn't call his girlfriend that night. He told her he was working late and she said fine, and he sat in his office until almost 9 o'clock going through case records on his screen, pulling conviction files from 2013 forward, cross-referencing evidence logs with chain of custody documentation, looking for the specific kind of discrepancy that you could mistake for clerical error the first time and couldn't the second. By 9 o'clock he had found 11 cases. He drove home and sat on his couch and did not turn on the television. The thing about evidence rooms is that they require trust. The entire architecture of criminal prosecution is a chain, suspect to arrest to booking to evidence to courtroom to conviction, and the links in that chain are the documents, the logs, the forms, the signatures. The chain only works if nobody is cutting it in the dark and soldering it back together. Everyone who works in law enforcement understands this intellectually, the way everyone understands that their food has been handled by strangers in kitchens they've never seen. You have to decide at some level to trust the process or you can't function inside it. Carl Pruitt had been deciding that for 10 years, and it was starting to cost him in ways he couldn't have anticipated. He was 51 and had a bad left knee from a fall on icy steps in 2019 that hadn't healed right, and he walked with a slight lisp that he disguised at work by keeping his gait wide and slow. His wife Denise had left him in 2021, not because of anything she knew but because of the atmospheric pressure of living with someone who carries a thing they won't name. She told him he was absent even when he was present, which was accurate and which he'd had no response to. He saw his kids on alternate weekends and took them to movies he didn't follow. He and Culver still worked well together in the professional sense. They read rooms well as a pair, and they had the shorthand of long partnership, and when they cleared cases their closure rate was cited in department metrics. Culver had twice been recommended for captain and twice been passed over for reasons that were never made entirely clear, but that Culver had absorbed with the patience of a man who knows his leverage runs in both directions. In the first week of September, Pruitt noticed something. It wasn't dramatic, he wasn't watching for it. He was walking past the records coordinator's office in the basement. He'd come down to pull a file from the archives for an active case, and through the window in the door he saw Marlene Doss sitting at her desk with a man he didn't immediately recognize. The man had his back to the glass and was leaning forward slightly, looking at something spread on the desk. Marlene's expression was the thing that caught Pruitt's attention. She had the stillness of someone who has gone careful, someone choosing each word after examining it, not frightened, watchful. Pruitt kept walking. He found his file. He went back upstairs. He mentioned it to Culver at lunch in an entirely casual way. They were at a barbecue place 2 blocks from the department, the kind that had been there for 30 years and had plastic tablecloths and sweet tea in mason jars, and pulled pork that came in portions that felt like an argument. He said he'd been in the basement and seen Marlene Doss with somebody going over documents. Culver was tearing the end off a piece of cornbread. What kind of documents? Couldn't see, could have been anything. Culver ate the cornbread. He drank some tea. The restaurant was loud, ceiling fan, other conversations, the screen door banging open every minute when someone came in, and his expression didn't change in any way that would read on a body camera. But Pruitt had known him for a long time and he saw the adjustment, the way something behind the eyes recalibrates. She's probably just doing the conversion project, Culver said. Probably, Pruitt said. They finished lunch and went back to work and neither of them mentioned it again. But that evening Culver stayed late, which wasn't unusual, and accessed the property room with his command-level key card, which was logged by the system and which he knew was logged, and which he did anyway because there were certain habits of control you couldn't fully suppress. What he found when he went to pull the web box was that the box was not there. It had been checked out by the DA's office according to the log. 32 boxes checked out 3 weeks prior, part of the digital conversion project. Routine. He drove home. He put Tyler to bed and watched his wife Michelle read on the couch and thought about the Marcus web case and what was in that box and what was not in that box, and whether the discrepancy he had spent 10 years maintaining would be visible to anyone who looked at it carefully enough. He had always known on some level that the documents were the vulnerability, not the convictions. Those were done, sealed. Most of the defendants had served time or were still serving it, and their appeals windows were long closed. The vulnerability was the paper trail, the originals, the things that hadn't been digitized when he made his adjustments, the things that sat in those bankers' boxes in the basement, accumulating the kind of quiet that wrong things accumulate in dark spaces. He went to bed and lay awake until 2 a.m. listening to Michelle breathe. Ray Fontaine called the State Bureau of Investigation on a Thursday morning from his personal cell phone, standing in the parking lot of a Walgreens 3 blocks from the office. He asked for Agent Dana Kimura, who he knew from a prior case involving financial fraud at a county contractor, and when she answered he said, "I have something you're going to want to see in person, and I need you to understand that I need it kept at your level until we know what we have." Dana Kimura was 44 years old and had been with the SBI for 16 years. She drove a state-issued Ford and wore her hair pulled back and had the manner of someone who had heard a lot of things described as urgent and had developed a way of listening that withheld its reaction until the evidence was on the table. She drove to Harwick the following Monday. Marlene walked her through everything in a conference room at a law firm that Ray had borrowed for the purpose, specifically because he did not want this conversation happening in a building that shared infrastructure with the Harwick Police Department. Marlene had been thorough. Over the preceding 2 weeks, working overtime she didn't clock, she had pulled and cross-referenced 68 cases from 2013 through 2022. She had found 23 with documentation irregularities significant enough to flag. She had organized them chronologically in a binder with color-coded tabs and a summary sheet at the front that she had typed herself and printed on her home computer, because she didn't want it going through the office printer. Dana Kimura went through the binder without speaking for 45 minutes. When she was done, she looked up at Marlene and said, "Tell me about the chain of custody for these originals. Where are they now?" "In my car," Marlene said. Dana looked at her. "I made copies of everything before I moved the originals. The copies are in the DA's office under my regular filing. The originals are in a box in my trunk." "How long have they been in your trunk?" "9 days. Dana Kimura made a note. "Okay," she said. She didn't praise Marlene for this. She wrote down exactly what had happened with the documents and where they were, and she asked a series of procedural questions in a flat, attentive voice, and when she was done she looked at Ray and said, "I'm going to need a forensic document examiner, and I'm going to need access to the property room logs going back to 2013. "The property room is in the HPD building," Ray said. "I know where it is," Dana said. What followed was not fast. Federal investigations are slow machines and state-level SBI investigations are slower, and this one was complicated by the fact that the evidence of wrongdoing was itself evidence that had to be carefully handled to avoid contaminating the chain of custody that was already compromised. Dana Kimura coordinated with the FBI field office in Charlotte. A forensic document examiner from the state crime lab drove up in the third week of September and spent 2 days going over the originals that Marlene had pulled, looking at ink chemistry and paper fiber and handwriting patterns. The examiner's preliminary finding, shared verbally with Dana and written up 2 weeks later in a report that ran to 68 pages, 9 of the chain of custody documents showed evidence of alteration. 4 showed evidence of having been written in whole or in part after the date stamped on them, based on ink oxidation inconsistencies. 3 contained what appeared to be the same handwriting in the case number field as in the signature line of a different officer, meaning the case number appeared to have been added by whoever signed the form, rather than the officer who completed the original booking. The signature appeared in 7 of the 9 altered documents to be a variant of the same hand. Dana cross-referenced the 7 documents with the booking officers of record. 4 different officers were nominally responsible for those 7 cases, but 2 of the cases had a supervisory review signature that matched no officer in the chain, a looping D initial that appeared on both. She pulled the personnel signatures on file for the detective division. Lieutenant Dennis Culver had a distinctive signature. He'd been signing documents since 2005 and his hand hadn't changed much. The D was a full loop that swept under the first name before returning, a stylistic habit that was uncommon enough to stand out in comparison. It stood out. Marlene was aware by October that things were in motion, because Ray would stop by her office occasionally and ask her questions about specific cases in the same careful, unrevealing tone she'd first heard from him in August, and she had become fluent in what his questions meant even when they didn't say what they meant. She did her job. She processed documents. She drove Eli to his school play rehearsal on Wednesday evenings and made sure he had lunch money and helped him with a history project on the Korean War that was more interesting than she'd expected. She slept reasonably well, mostly. Sometimes at 3 a.m. she lay in the dark and thought about the men in those conviction records. 23 cases, 23 defendants, some of them certainly guilty of something. Some of them possibly not guilty of the specific thing they'd been convicted of. Most of them black, all of them poor. None of them with attorneys who'd had the resources or the time to scrutinize the evidence chain the way a well-funded defense might have, and she thought about the years. The accumulated years. 7 years here. 5 years there? A man's 30s in a cell in Caldwell Correctional because the paper trail had been adjusted in a basement by someone who had decided the outcome justified it. She didn't let herself spend too long in that place. She had work to do. Culver knew something was happening by November. It wasn't one thing. It was the aggregate of small readings that a person with his experience in law enforcement develops over time. The way certain people stop making full eye contact in the hallway. The way a request to the property room for case files from 2014 came through the DA's office rather than directly from an investigating officer. The way the department's IT administrator had asked in a staff meeting about the timeline for the digital conversion project, and gotten an answer that was slightly too careful. He was reading the weather of his own building, and the weather had changed. He ran it through the filter of what he knew, the web box, the misfiled form which he had suspected existed since the lunch conversation with Pruitt in August. He had gone back through his own records, the copies he kept in a locked box in his home office, the ledger of cases where he'd made adjustments, which he maintained not out of compulsion but because he needed to know what was documented and what was in his memory only. The ledger was in a fireproof safe behind the drywalled section of his garage, and he had looked at it twice since August, and each time he had closed it and locked it and told himself the same thing. The originals are contaminated, yes, but contaminated doesn't mean prosecutable. Chain of custody is a mess already. Any competent defense attorney would exploit that. He believed this partly because it was legally arguable and partly because he needed to believe it. He did not stop going to work. He did not behave unusually. He cleared an aggravated assault case in late October that was clean, genuinely clean, the kind of investigative work he was actually good at: witness canvassing, timeline reconstruction, cell tower data, and a suspect who cracked in the 4th hour of an interview because Culver was patient and thorough and knew how to read the silences between a man's answers. He filed the case and wrote it up, and it was good police work, real police work, and he let himself feel that for a while. He coached Tyler's last game of the fall season on a Saturday morning when the air was finally cool, and the maples along the outfield fence had gone orange and gold. Tyler went 2 for 3 and made a clean stop at third base that drew applause from the parents on the bleachers. Culver stood at the fence and watched his kid take a throw, and his face did the thing faces do when the moment is genuinely good, and the person inside it is somewhere else. The federal grand jury subpoena came on a Tuesday in early December. It was directed to the Harwick Police Department and the Caldwell County DA's office, and it requested, under seal, the complete property room records and chain of custody documentation for 41 specifically enumerated cases spanning 2013 to 2022. The subpoena was delivered by a federal marshal to the department's legal liaison at 8:45 in the morning, and it was accompanied by a preservation order that made it a federal crime to alter, destroy, or remove any document in the property room without court approval. The department's chief, Gerald Morrow, read the subpoena in his office with his door closed for approximately 12 minutes before he called the city attorney. Culver was in a debrief meeting when his phone buzzed. He looked at the screen, saw the chief's extension, and excused himself. He took the call in the hallway outside the conference room, standing near the water fountain, his back to the corridor. The chief told him about the subpoena. He read him the case numbers. Culver stood with the phone against his ear and felt the hallway go very quiet around him in the specific way that quiet arrives when you've been waiting for something and it's arrived, and there's a difference between the anticipating and the having. "The feds," he said. "SBI referred it. This is U.S. Attorney's Office, Dennis." "What cases are they flagging?" The chief read some of the numbers. Culver recognized most of them. His hand was in his pocket and his thumb pressed against the seam of his pants pocket in a slow, steady rhythm that was the only outward sign of anything. "What do you need from me?" he said. "Nothing yet. City attorney says we cooperate fully. We don't touch anything in the property room. There's a marshal downstairs." "Understood," Culver said. He went back into the meeting and sat down and contributed 2 relevant observations about the active case they were discussing. And when the meeting ended, he went to his desk and sat there for 11 minutes doing nothing. Then he opened his case management system and began reviewing his notes on a burglary series he'd been working, because being at his desk doing normal things was the only useful action available to him. Carl Pruitt had not been named in the subpoena. This was not because he was innocent of involvement. He had co-signed 3 of the altered forms and had been present in the property room during at least 2 of the adjustments Culver had made. But the forensic analysis had focused on the supervisory signatures, and Pruitt's role had been primarily one of presence, of not tasking, of turning his back on certain things and calling that neutrality. The distinction between active participation and material complicity was one that federal prosecutors would spend considerable time with later. In December, Pruitt sat with the awareness of his own position, the way you sit with a tooth that might need a root canal, probing it with the tongue, not yet ready to make the appointment, telling yourself it might resolve. He and Culver had not discussed any of this since August. They had worked together on cases, eaten lunch together twice, exchanged the standard professional speech of 2 people who know each other well and are performing not knowing each other too well. The performance had the slightly elevated quality of effort that both of them could detect and neither acknowledged. In the second week of December, Pruitt called a defense attorney named Susan Gorky in Charlotte, whose number he'd gotten from a friend of a friend. He made the call from his car in the parking lot of a grocery store at 6:15 on a Wednesday evening, watching the entrance and the exit out of habit. He told Susan Gorky that he needed to discuss a hypothetical situation involving a colleague and evidence handling, and whether there was any exposure for someone who had been a bystander rather than a principal. Susan Gorky listened to the hypothetical for about 4 minutes and then said, "The person in this hypothetical should come in and talk to me in person and bring nothing with them except whatever they've written down in their own handwriting that they want protected under attorney-client privilege." When Pruitt said, "Tomorrow if possible," she said, "next week at the latest." Pruitt sat in the parking lot for a while after he hung up. A woman came out of the grocery store pushing a cart with a child sitting in the basket, the kid maybe 3 years old holding a banana with both hands. Pruitt watched them cross the lot. He started his car. Dana Kimura sat across from Dennis Culver for the first time on a Thursday morning in January in a conference room at the Federal Building in Charlotte. He had come with his attorney, a man named Brian Wachowski who had 20 years of criminal defense experience and a reputation for being prepared. Culver was dressed in slacks and a button-down shirt with no tie, and he looked like what he was, which was a competent, experienced law enforcement officer in a conference room with federal agents, maintaining the stillness of a man who understood procedure from both sides of the table. Dana had 2 colleagues with her, an FBI special agent named Torres and an analyst named Park, and she had a binder that was thicker than Marlene's original binder, and she set it on the table between them and let it sit there for a moment before she opened it. "We're going to go through some case files today, Lieutenant," she said, "and I want to be clear about what we're doing. We're not here to take a statement. We're giving you an opportunity to provide context on some documentation questions before the grand jury process moves forward. Your attorney has been briefed on the scope." Culver looked at the binder, then he looked at Dana. "Sure," he said. What followed was 3.5 hours of conversation that moved at the pace of someone carefully navigating a room they know is wired. Culver answered questions about procedure and policy, and general evidence handling practices, with the precision of someone who had spent his career understanding exactly where the line between informative and incriminating fell. He said he didn't recall the specifics of individual cases from 8 years ago. He said that the property room had experienced staffing issues in 2014 and 2015 that had led to documentation inconsistencies that the department had subsequently addressed. He said that chain of custody forms were handled by multiple officers, and that discrepancies in case numbers were a known problem that dated back to a software transition in 2013. He was good. Dana had interviewed enough people to know when someone was good, and she felt Torres shift almost imperceptibly in his seat beside her when Culver walked back a third answer to the exact edge of plausibility. He wasn't lying in ways she could immediately prove. He was building an alternative architecture of the facts that was technically possible if you accepted all of its premises. She set a photograph on the table. It was an enlargement of a signature field from one of the 9 altered documents, the looping D initial, clean and distinctive. "Can you identify this signature?" she said. Culver looked at it. His attorney put a hand on the table. "We've discussed the signature analysis," Wachowski said. "My client has provided a response in writing. I'm asking him to look at it and tell me if he can identify it," Dana said. Culver looked at her. "I've seen similar signature styles," he said. "I can't positively identify that as mine or not mine from a photocopy." 7 documents have it, Dana said. "So you've told me." The room was quiet for a moment. Dana could hear the ventilation system and a phone ringing somewhere down the hall. She looked at Culver and he looked back at her, and there was nothing theatrical in it, no defiance, no smugness. Just the held quality of a man who has prepared for this and is executing the preparation. "We're done for today," Wachowski said. Marcus Webb was released from Caldwell Correctional on a Tuesday in February, 4 months after his attorney, provided by the Innocence Project's North Carolina affiliate, had filed a motion for post-conviction relief based on the newly discovered evidence irregularities. He had served 6 years and 4 months of a 7-year sentence. He was 41 years old. He walked out of the facility in jeans and a blue jacket that his mother had brought, into a February morning that was cold and gray and smelled of diesel from a truck idling at the gate. His mother was there, his younger brother Marcus Jr., who was now 19 and whom Webb had last seen when the boy was 12. A woman from the Innocence Project named Caroline Bates who shook his hand and told him what the next steps were. Webb stood in the parking lot and looked at the sky and didn't say anything for a moment. His mother was crying. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and he looked at Caroline Bates over his mother's head and said, "What's the count?" "We're looking at 11 cases where relief is likely," Caroline said. 6 more are under review. Webb nodded and himmed. "The federal grand jury is still seated." He nodded again and they walked to the car. The federal indictment came down in April. Dennis Culver was charged on 11 counts. Civil rights violations under 18 U.S.C. Section 242, obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and conspiracy. The conspiracy charge brought Carl Pruitt in on 3 counts, reduced from 7 after Pruitt had in January walked into Susan Gorky's office in Charlotte and spent 2 days providing a proffer to federal prosecutors. He was not granted immunity. There was no immunity on offer, but the cooperation reduced his exposure significantly. 2 other officers from the department were named as unindicted co-conspirators. Their names appeared in the indictment, and then in every story the Harwick Observer and the Charlotte Observer and the AP filed in the 48 hours after the unsealing. The department's Internal Affairs Division, which had no functional independence from the chain of command, was suspended from all oversight functions by the city manager, who had been on the phone with the city attorney for most of the previous night. Chief Morrow gave a press statement outside the department's Garfield Avenue entrance on the morning the indictment was unsealed. He said he was shocked and saddened. He said the department's commitment to integrity was unshakable. He said that the actions alleged in the indictment did not reflect the values of the men and women who served the community every day. The statement took 4 minutes. There were questions from the assembled reporters, and Morrow answered 3 of them with the same 4 sentences in different order, and then went back inside. Culver was arrested at his home at 6:15 that morning, before the press conference, before his son left for school. The arrest was made by federal marshals assisted by SBI agents. He came to the door in a gray t-shirt and jeans, and stood on the porch while the marshals explained the situation with the precise, procedural courtesy of a federal arrest, which is different from a local arrest in several ways that matter. His wife appeared in the doorway behind him in a bathrobe. She put one hand on the door frame. Tyler appeared at the top of the stairs inside, visible through the screen door, holding his baseball glove. He had his father's eyes and his mother's chin, and he was 15 years old, and he stood at the top of the stairs and looked at his father on the porch and the two men in jackets, and he was not old enough yet to have a category for what he was seeing. Culver turned his head and looked at his son. He held it for a moment. "Go back to your room," he said. Tyler didn't move. "Hey," Culver's voice was the same voice he used at the fence on game days, not loud, not hard, just present and steady. "Go to your room, okay, I'll call you." The boy went. Culver turned back to the marshals. "Let me get my shoes," he said. The arraignment was covered by 3 local television stations and 2 print outlets. Culver appeared in a gray suit with Brian Wachowski at his side, and entered a not guilty plea in a voice that carried to the back of the courtroom without effort. He looked at no one in the gallery with anything that read as either defiance or apology. He sat and he listened to the charges read, and his face was the face of a man hearing something he had known was coming. The courtroom had bad acoustics. The clerk spoke too fast. Outside the tall windows, the April trees were coming into green, and a pigeon was walking the ledge on the building across the street with the complete indifference to human events that pigeons maintain. Bail was set at $250,000. Wachowski had it arranged before Culver reached the holding room. Marlene heard about the arrest on the radio during her drive to work. She was on Prescott Street, stopped at the light near the basement window of her own office, and the morning news ran the story as the second item after a piece about a water main break. She turned the radio up. The anchor gave Culver's name, rank, charge count, and the department's statement in about 90 seconds and then moved on. Marlene sat through 2 cycles of the light before the car behind her honked. She parked and went inside and made a cup of coffee in the break room and carried it to her desk. Her inbox had 14 new items. The digital conversion project was at 62%. She had a meeting at 11 with Ray about a separate matter, a different case, a different problem, the new problem that had arrived to take the place of the resolved one. She drank her coffee and opened the first item in her inbox. It was a request for records from the web appeal. She had already pulled the documents. She'd done it the week before, knowing it was coming. She attached them to the response email and sent it. She worked through the morning. Around 10:30 she noticed Ray in the hallway, stopping at her door. He looked at her for a moment. She looked back. "You doing okay?" he said. "Yep," she said. He nodded once and moved on. The trial was set for October. It would be delayed twice, first to January of the following year and then to the following spring, because federal trials are scheduled by federal courts and federal courts have their own relationship to calendar time. Wachowski filed 4 pretrial motions, 3 of which were denied, and 1 of which resulted in a ruling that suppressed 2 pieces of evidence on Fourth Amendment grounds that had nothing to do with Culver's guilt or innocence on the core charges, but that reduced the conspiracy count's evidentiary spine enough that Wachowski considered it a significant procedural win. In the meantime, 11 men whose convictions had been tied to the compromised evidence cases filed post-conviction motions. 6 of those motions were granted by April of the following year. Of the 6 men released, 3 were rearrested within 18 months on new charges unrelated to the original cases. 2 found employment. 1, a man named Robert Tillman, who had served 4.5 years for a drug conviction, got a job at a landscaping company in Kannapolis, and his company van was spotted by a local photographer in March, parked at a job site, the side of it reading Tillman and Sons Landscaping in hand-painted letters, R. Tillman's own name, which he had put there himself. The photographer posted the image and it circulated for a few days, and people had feelings about it in the way people do, and then it passed. Marcus Webb moved back to Harwick. He lived with his mother initially and then got an apartment on the east side. He drove for a rideshare company 3 nights a week and took community college classes in computer networking. He had a civil suit pending through an attorney in Raleigh that named the city of Harwick, the police department, and Dennis Culver personally. The case had a trial date 2 years out. The trial, when it finally came, lasted 19 days. Ray Fontaine sat in the gallery for 3 of them. He was not involved in the federal prosecution. That was DOJ's case, handled by an AUSA named Patricia Hollies, who was meticulous and patient, and had the jury's attention from the first hour. Ray watched from a bench near the back and took no notes, which was unusual for him, and he sat with his arms folded and watched Patricia Hollies walk the jury through 23 cases using a timeline projected on a screen at the front of the courtroom. The timeline was mostly about documents: chain of custody forms, booking logs, evidence tags, property room access records. The jury, 9 women and 3 men, 2 of them retired, one of them a high school teacher, one of them who managed a furniture warehouse, watched Patricia Hollies explain how evidence was supposed to move through the system, and then watched her show them how it had actually moved in these specific cases, and the gap between those two things was the case. Culver sat at the defense table and listened. Wachowski had coached him well, and his posture and expression throughout the 19 days conveyed engaged attentiveness without affect, the posture of a man who respected the process even when the process was wrong about him. Some jurors looked at him and some didn't. The ones who looked at him the most were doing the thing jurors do when they're trying to figure out if they believe someone, which is a different project from figuring out if someone is guilty. The defense argument was procedural complexity. The evidence handling system was broken before Culver ever entered it. The signatures were ambiguous. The document examiner's conclusions were based on probabilistic chemistry that fell short of certainty, and the witnesses who corroborated the prosecution's timeline had motivations to cooperate with federal prosecutors that the jury should weigh carefully. Wachowski was good. He was correct about some of the procedural complexity. He made Patricia Hollies work for several of her exhibits. The jury was out for 4 days. They came back on a Thursday afternoon with guilty verdicts on 7 of the 11 counts. The 3 acquittals were on the civil rights charges where the evidence was most dependent on the document examiner's probabilistic conclusions. The 4 convictions on the core evidence tampering and obstruction counts held. Sentencing was scheduled 60 days out. Culver stood for the reading and he looked at the jury, and whatever was in his face was in his face, and Wachowski put his hand on Culver's arm briefly, the standard gesture, and then they sat down and the judge began talking and the afternoon kept going. In the corridor outside the courtroom afterward, Patricia Hollies took a phone call and Dana Kimura spoke briefly to 2 reporters and then declined further comment, and people who had been waiting for the verdict dispersed in the way people do when a thing that required waiting is over and the waiting has defined them enough that the ending is strange. Pruitt was not in the building. He had pled guilty in October to 1 count of obstruction as part of the cooperation agreement. His sentencing had already occurred earlier that month, and he had received 18 months probation and a permanent prohibition from law enforcement employment. He had not gone to prison. He had gone home to his apartment in Harwick, a 2-bedroom near the highway that he'd rented after the divorce, and he had watched the TV for a while and then turned it off. He no longer had his badge. He no longer had his service weapon. He had his truck and his furniture and his kids on alternate weekends and a part-time job at a building supply company that a friend had arranged, checking inventory on a tablet in a warehouse that was loud with forklifts and smelled of sawdust and concrete. He was good at the inventory work. He didn't mind the noise. Culver was sentenced on a Friday morning in May. The courtroom was fuller than it had been for most of the trial. A verdict draws fewer people than a sentencing, but this one had media present and several of the men whose convictions had been vacated, and a row of people near the back who were families of those men, and the gallery had the specific quality of a room in which multiple people are waiting for something they've been waiting for a long time. He received 8 years in federal prison on the consolidated counts. The judge spoke for 11 minutes about the nature of the violations and the systemic harm of evidence corruption and the specific responsibility borne by those in authority in the criminal justice system. It was not a speech. It was the calculated language of a federal sentence, chosen for precision rather than impact, and it landed in the room with the weight of a document rather than a declaration. Culver stood for it. He had stood for everything from the arraignment to the verdict to this. He stood with his hands at his sides and he listened, and when it was done he turned to Wachowski and said something low that Wachowski responded to with a nod, and then the marshals came. His wife was not in the courtroom. Tyler was not there. His daughter was not there. He had spoken with Michelle the night before and the conversation had been the kind that leaves both people holding the phone after it ends, not hanging up, just present in their separate silences. Marlene Das was not in the courtroom. She was in the basement of the Caldwell County DA's office, working through the last of the boxes from the digital conversion project, which had been delayed by the investigative demands of the preceding year but which had never been canceled, because the underlying need for it was real and the budget had already been allocated. The project was at 91%. She had a box open on the cart beside her, pulling files one at a time and feeding the relevant pages through the scanner and verifying the digital copies against the originals before returning them to the folder in the correct order. The scanner had a rhythm intake process eject, and she had worked to it for long enough that she no longer heard it consciously. The fluorescent light buzzed. Outside the window well, the May afternoon was visible as a strip of sky and the occasional shadow of a pedestrian crossing above. She found another discrepancy at 2:15. A chain of custody form in a box of cases from 2011, 2 years before Culver had moved to the detective division. A different case number, a different officer's name. She set it in the third pile, the one she'd been keeping on instinct since August of the previous year, and kept working. She didn't say anything to anyone that day. She took her lunch break at her desk, ate a sandwich, and texted Eli about what time he needed to be picked up from his friend's house. He texted back a thumbs up, which was the primary unit of communication in his current phase of development. She put her phone down and looked at the third pile for a moment. Then she looked back at the scanner. The next form went through. The machine read it, processed it, and produced a clean digital copy that would exist in the system now, searchable, preserved, linked to the chain it belonged to. Outside, the May sky sat above Prescott Street in the way May skies do in the Piedmont, pale and wide and warm, with something building in the south that would arrive as rain by evening. The scanner kept going. And